The B Podcast Network is proud to be sponsored by Playworks. Chronic absenteeism is one of the most persistent challenges we're facing in education, and it's changing what learning looks like in schools right now. I know many of you got into this work to help kids learn. That won't happen if they're not in school. Most schools have already tried the usual fixes. The real question is what actually changes student behavior day to day? The answer might be recess. Not as an afterthought, but as part of the school day that shapes relationships, behavior, and whether students want to come back tomorrow. Playworks partners with schools to make recess safe, engaging, and a place where kids are actively playing together. And the impact is measurable. A UC Berkeley study of Title I schools found significantly lower chronic absenteeism in schools that partnered with Playworks. Learn how Playworks can help you increase kids' sense of belonging and make sure they want to be in school. Visit playworks.org/podcast. That's PLAYWORKS.org/podcast. Welcome in, everyone. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Really a pleasure to have you here for today's episode with my guest, Brig Leane. Brig is the former principal of Fruita Middle School in Colorado. He has over 25 years of experience in education, having been an assistant principal. He's also taught at the middle and high school levels in inner city, suburban, and rural schools in California and Colorado. In 2017, and then again in 2018, Fruita Middle School made Getting Smart's list of 85 schools in the nation that other educators should visit. And education is actually Brig's second career, following his successful service as an officer in the U.S. Coast Guard, having attained the rank of lieutenant commander. And I guess this has unintentionally kind of turned into Coast Guard month here. I don't know, in fact, what order these episodes will all publish in. So forgive me if we're a little out of order, but the most recent interview here on the show was with Nicholas Bradford, who retired from the U.S. Coast Guard in 2023 after 24 years of honorable service. So that's just how it works out here. Brig's latest book is called The PLC Dashboard: Implementing, Leading, and Sustaining Your Professional Learning Community at Work. Brig, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm honored to be with you guys tonight. Thankful to just be a part of this. I'm so thankful we have a way to connect with other educators and to share what's working.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to start out with something that is certainly informs, I'm sure, the book and all of your books, but zooms out a little bit. Having done the introduction here of education as your second career, you also write a lot in the introduction to the book about, I think some of the foundational perspectives that really shape the way you approach education, the way you may advise educators to look at it. I would love to just hear you talk about your why in education in general, like why you got into it, why you do the work you do, and what fuels you.
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, as you mentioned, my first career was as a Coast Guard officer. And we had a saying in the Coast Guard, and that was this: it's not your fault that somebody went out in the ocean and ended up in trouble, but it is now your problem to solve as a coastie. And that mindset served me well in the Coast Guard. And it really serves me well as an educator, because it is not our fault that kids come to us with all kinds of issues. It's not our fault that maybe even as an educational leader, the teachers on staff aren't quite sure how to collaborate. It's not our fault, but it is definitely our problem to solve. And so that mindset served me well there. It serves me well in education. And I think back to all those situations out in the ocean that, were kind of unpredictable. And as I would kind of debrief some of them, I really found out that I enjoyed the training and the teaching that I got to do. And that's primarily, I thought, where can I do more of this? When I separated from the service, I thought, where can I do more of this? And it turns out a 22 language inner city high school in East San Diego was more than happy to hire me as a math teacher, and found out within weeks, this is the career for me. And so very thankful to be an educator and thankful for the people who took a chance on me when I started out.
So getting into the history of your work with PLC at work. One of the things you write early in the book is that the PLC at work process is simply the best strategy to significantly impact both students and educators. Would love to just have you introduce your history with PLC at work, how you became acquainted with it, how you used it in your roles as an educator, and then why you developed the belief about this being the best strategy, and something, of course, that you've continued to take on as an author and in your continuing work now.
Yeah, I had many false starts in the PLC process. I'd had many experiences where, a couple of educators were put together to, you know, talk about things. And frankly, my first couple of experiences with the quote unquote PLC process were very ineffective. And frankly, they were frustrating. It wasn't until I was getting my master's degree to become a principal that I actually read any of Dufour's books, and I read a book called PLCs at Work. And I remember thinking to myself that nothing that I was reading about in the book was anything like what people were calling a PLC on the campuses where I was a teacher. And I remember my dad said to me, he goes, I expressed my frustration to him, and he said, "Well, are you doing what you can do?" Well, at the time, my partner was another eighth grade math teacher, but he'd come out of retirement. He was an old wrestling coach. He didn't even like the smell of dry erase markers, so he preferred chalk. And he didn't like even a computer running in his room, but he was my partner. And I thought, you know what? I wasn't doing everything I could do. I hadn't reached out to this partner of mine, George, to see if we could figure out what these kids were supposed to learn, regardless of which teacher they'd been assigned. So I went back and I asked George if he'd be willing to try this PLC thing as it was written up. And to my shock and amazement, he said yes. And so George and I just simply we determined what's something these kids had to know. I'm thinking of the 4 critical questions of the PLC process. And the first question is, what do we want these kids to know? And George and I had taught some things. And so we said, well, what's one thing? And I can't remember what the very first one was, but let's say it was adding fractions with unlike denominators. And so we gave an assessment. And I can remember how cruddy the results were. It was like 14% of the kids could do it. And I remember it because George slammed his fist on the table and says, "But we taught that." Well, I said to him, but the kids didn't learn it, or it didn't stick. And so George and I intervened with one skill after another. We ended up doing 11 skills that year. And I didn't think much of it. I got a job as an assistant principal after that. George went back into retirement. But our kids grew more on the state of Colorado test than any other kid in grades 3 through 10 in any tested subject. And I became a believer in the simplicity of this process. You hear things like collective teacher efficacy, and that's a pretty fancy phrase, but people have to have a way to turn that into some actionable and doable things. And that's where the PLC process just became real to me. And so I had experiences at the teacher level. I also had experiences as a principal implementing the PLC process in a meaningful and doable way. And now I do it as a consultant helping schools all over the nation.
What are some of those things that maybe it was lowercase PLC, or the when you were experiencing PLCs done not in this way?
Like PLC Light.
Yeah. What were some of the things that you recognized as being fundamentally different, right? Once you got introduced to PLC at work and what it should really look like. And because I'm sure, I mean, I don't know how many years ago that was, and yet I'm sure like a lot of that still is happening.
Yeah, I think one problem in general is that too many gatherings of educators aren't focused on the 4 critical questions. And I think what we have to do is make it simple. We got to say, all right, what's one skill in the next month of school that these kids got to know? What's one skill that we'd be embarrassed if they couldn't do at the end of this month? And we then write a short, quiz-like, not end of chapter-like way to assess whether kids have learned it or not. Whereas my previous experiences with the PLC process were not that. They were more like, let's just get together and talk educational stuff. And I was kind of like, well, if we're just going to share opinions, I'd rather go with mine. But the PLC process is about, let's both give the assessment, or the team of 2 or 3 give the assessment, and then let's share results, not with the intention of judging one another, but with the intention of learning new instructional strategies that we didn't previously know. And for that to happen, you need a little bit of structure, and you need to kind of understand, first off, why we're doing this process. And the why is so that more kids learn it, those essential skills, and so that the teachers grow as professionals in community. So you got to have the purpose down. You got to know why we're doing it. And then you need a little bit of structure for how to do it. And that's something I feel like over the past couple of decades of doing this, I feel like I've just learned a lot about how to make this process very doable, because there are some people probably in our profession who don't want to collaborate and just want to close their classroom door and do their own thing. But I think most of us in education recognize that at least in 2025, working in isolation is not really a sustainable pathway with all the challenges and complexities and even the dynamics of the classroom. So a lot of people want to collaborate, but no one wants to waste time. So you need a kind of a system and a process to do the PLC work in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So the dashboard, we'll obviously talk quite a bit about it here, but to start to introduce us to it in brief, like, what is it? What does it do?
All right. So one of the challenges that I really feel became apparent, especially after the pandemic, is that principals were able to really dedicate less and less time to the PLC process because of many, I'd just say, post-pandemic challenges we're now facing in education. One is, it used to be tough to find a substitute teacher in the building on Fridays. Now it's tough every day.
Mm.
We used to have hiring pools where you could hire, some fantastic teachers and there'd be many to choose from. Now those pools are shrinking up quite a bit. And so sometimes principals were having to hire, really maybe even underqualified people to fill a position. And so given that, and given all the general pressures on a principal on a day-to-day basis that find them, I was seeing that they just didn't have much time to donate to this process. And they needed a way to know in seconds which team needed more support. And so the dashboard is a low-tech, very low-tech. It could even be on a bulletin board in the teacher's lounge. And what it really does is on the left-hand side, it just lists the name of teams, like the first grade team or the Algebra 1 team or the 7th grade history team. And it also lists singletons, that group I have a real heart for. Those are like the only band teacher on a campus or the only art teacher at an elementary school who, they don't think the PLC process applies to them. It does. It just looks a little different. And so this dashboard would just list the names of those teams and singletons. And then there'd be a way to record when a teacher got through the expected work they were to produce. And that, what they should produce, I have boiled down to in my book into a one-page template for teams and a very similar one-page template for singletons. That just helps a principal. Imagine if you're looking at a bulletin board, or I also produce this on a Google Sheet with hyperlinks to these documents I was just talking about. But imagine you're a busy principal and you have 6 minutes to donate to the PLC process today because your day just went in the blender. Mm-hmm. One glance at the dashboard and you see that the 10th grade English team hasn't been able to produce much. That gives you an indication. Maybe that's the team I need to put on my schedule. I need to go meet with them next week. And during their team meeting next time, I'm gonna be with that team, not to scrutinize them, but to support them and to find out what they need. So the dashboard is really a way for leaders, those can be teacher leaders like a guiding coalition and principals, to know in seconds who needs more support. So that's the idea of the dashboard. And so the book is about how do you build up to that so that a dashboard doesn't seem like this thing people are saying, what are you measuring here? So that's the big picture of what a dashboard is, and it is low tech, let me assure you.
I think, yeah, it would be good to address, in fact, as we're continuing this conversation, the singletons. And I assume for many listeners, especially if they haven't heard about this before, it would be non-obvious as to how the PLC process applies to those singletons and how they might engage with it, how it looks the same or different, and how that would be happening across the school, right? And so I feel like it's worth touching on that before we move ahead.
Yeah, they're a group I have such a heart for. I wrote a book for them with my co-author John Yost a few years back because what we were finding was that the singletons, that band teacher or that CTE teacher, or even that AP teacher, who's really doing their work on their own, we found that those people didn't think the PLC process applied to them. But if you know the PLC process well, there's three big ideas to the PLC process. And the first of those big ideas is a focus on learning. That means making a shift from the teach, test, record the grades and move on mindset to let's determine something that's essential to begin with. Then let's teach. Then let's give a short, formative way to assess whether kids have learned that skill. Then let's intervene for the kids who couldn't do it. And at the same time in class, let's extend for those who can. And then let's make changes to our instruction. And when you think about those steps, determining something that's essential, teaching, intervening and extending, giving a formative assessment, a singleton can do those things too. And that meets big idea one of making a shift from teaching to learning. So the second big idea is collaboration. And so I think too often building principles put the need to collaborate before they put big idea one, which is the learning focus. They get the order reversed. And so then what they do is they take all these singletons, like the band teacher and the computers teacher and the ag teacher, and they sweep them together in a dustpan and say, go collaborate. And these people who are, frankly, some of the most outstanding educators who oftentimes the only reason kids come to school is to take their class. These people are frustrated and they often have so many preps, and this just becomes one more ridiculous thing to do. And at best, they'll, I guess, comply. And at worst, it'll wreak havoc on your school culture. But those singletons need to have meaningful ways to collaborate where it makes sense. The last thing I want to do is force two singletons into a collaborative structure that really feels like it has no meaning to them. So that's what the first book was about. And it goes into a lot of detail on what we call the three on-ramps, which are ways for a singleton to collaborate. On-ramp one is virtually. Find someone who teaches the same thing in a different school. On-ramp two is find cross-cutting content. Like maybe you both want kids to be strong digital citizens. Maybe you want kids to have more grit. And while those things might not be specific parts of your curriculum, we still care about it and we could collaborate in a meaningful way on those common contents. So just a little mindset into, or a little window into the singleton world.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you this, I think we have so many fantastic educators that are singletons, and this PLC process does apply to them. It just looks different and they need to have some clarity on that pathway.
Yeah. I want to talk about the dashboard. It's a tool to help leaders get started, right? And then getting into the ways in which it helps. But I kind of pulled this out of the foreword, actually, by Robert Eager. He says Brig continues to add to the growing body of evidence substantiating the fact that the lack of a knowledge base or lack of how to is no longer a viable excuse for not implementing the PLC at work process. Ultimately, we are left with the decision to act, to do, and the PLC dashboard is a valuable guidebook to accompany you on your school improvement journey. Wanted to use that as a way to ask the purpose behind the book and kind of your response to that view of, right, that the kind of the lack of how to can't be preventative to getting into the PLC at work process, and how to really use this book and other resources as a guide in establishing the goals around this, getting started, and kind of moving to implementation.
Yeah, it's 127 pages, and I appreciate you reading what Bob Aker wrote. Bob Aker is one of the original architects. He and Rick Dufour started the PLC process, so I was so thrilled that he was willing to write a foreword to my book. And the fact of the matter is, there are some people that are wondering why we should collaborate and stuff like that. And I do run into some of those folks. And in the beginning of the book, I even talk about what are my reasons for why we should do this PLC process. And I list
Hmm.
10 reasons of why we ought to do it. But I have found in my work with schools all over the country at the elementary, middle, and high school level is that there are plenty of people who frankly don't know how. And I know that seems a little bit crazy. They just don't know how to have teams collaborate in a meaningful way. And so, the four critical questions are out there that are supposed to focus a team on what they should collaborate around. But that wasn't quite enough. And so, as I worked with many teams, including my own in my school, I came up with what I call a 7-step learning cycle. And that 7-step learning cycle takes the four critical questions and just puts a little more meat on the bones and helps people know, what do we do first? What do we do second? What do we do third? And so on. And that 7-step learning cycle feeds into a one-page template. And that one-page template does the prompting. It prompts the team to know, okay, what is our essential skill? What is our SMART goal for what percent of kids we believe would stretch us? What is our intervention plan when, not if, kids don't learn it? And what instructional practices got the best results? So the 7-step cycle leads into the one-page template for a team or a singleton. And that one-page template becomes what's tracked on the dashboard so that principals can know in seconds which team or singleton is getting the expected work done.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way it helps somebody who, let's say you're a principal who's tried this PLC process before and it didn't quite go very well. Well, one issue on what it could be is maybe you just didn't really have a game plan or maybe even like a system to do it.
Hmm.
And, I listened to one of your earlier podcasts from Jen Schwanke, and she just said that clarity builds trust. And, even author Brene Brown would kind of echo that. She says, clarity is kindness.
Hmm.
And if we're unclear, in some ways, wouldn't that then be unkind? And so I think about the school district or the principal or the guiding coalition, the teacher leadership team that says, hey, teachers, go collaborate.
Right.
And here's this, these fantastic educators are sitting in this room during collaboration time. And maybe they aren't quite sure what to do. And that just breaks my heart because we are all so busy. Educators are so full of just things to do that we don't have time to waste. And nobody wants to collaborate. We want to collaborate, but it better be meaningful to us. And so I have found enough educators who need more structure. And that's what this simple 127-page book really does. It really says if you've restarted the PLC process many times or you've tried it and it didn't go, perhaps the issue is not that you don't want to, you don't know why. The issue maybe you just don't know how. So that's where I really think this meets teachers who are hungry for a process that's doable. And I mean doable in the best sense of the word. Teachers have lives. We get sick. We have sick days. There are fire drills. There are issues that come up. We got to have a process that's doable and yet still aims us to that goal of kids learning more and us having a way to learn from our colleagues.
When the teacher hops in the game and everyone's playing together, that builds camaraderie between students and adults. A principal from a Playworks school describes the dynamic many school leaders have experienced. When you partner with Playworks to support engaging recess, students get active, build valuable skills, connect, and carry positive energy back into the classroom. The impact shows up in learning time. Research from Mathematica found that schools with Playworks spent 27% less time transitioning from recess to learning, protecting valuable instructional minutes for teachers. One thing I love about Playworks is that it's designed for the realities schools face today. Their trainings are practical, manageable, and focused on building staff capacity without competing with instructional priorities. If attendance, behavior, or lost learning time are holding your school back, have a short, no obligation conversation to learn more. Visit playworks.org/podcast. Yeah. Yeah. And to this point of collaboration, I mean, we had some previous discussions here on the show, right? Collaboration versus coordination, right? And I think there's a lot of other C words, right? There's co-working, coexisting, compromising. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in the dynamics between coworkers that certainly fall short of collaboration. They are the results of maybe sharing a space or sharing a workplace. But I think you're hitting on an important point that people want to receive the benefits of collaboration, right? They don't just want to collaborate for its own sake. And if it's unclear that it's beneficial, it just becomes extra work, extra things to worry about because it's either not true collaboration or it's not happening mutually or around a plan or it's ineffective or whatever, right? And I think an interesting thing that you're laying out, I mean, I haven't really heard before here, I don't think, even the just discussion of like what's the work to be done or to be produced, that we tend to think in terms of outcomes that are meant to be generated, right? And like this is where the accountability is. And it applies, I have thought about this in terms of other types of professions, right? That a sales profession where ultimately you're judged based on the amount of sales you made in the quota. But what if there were accountability for the routine actions you should be taking, right? How you use this piece of collateral that was produced for you to be able to use sales, or how you just the number of calls you make or whatever it is, right? But if there was actual focus on being accountable for that and not just the end result, like would it lead to better results? Because, and same thing here, right? With I think the educators to say it's too late, number one, once we kind of get to the end of the unit or the end of the year and we see that the kids didn't learn, you can't rewind and do it
Right.
again. But you also can't fast forward to know exactly what's going to happen. What can you control is, okay, there's certain things that we know are the actions to take that build toward results. So if we focus on having those things emphasized and then looking at that across teams and across schools to see like where are the predictable shortfalls going to be. This team's really struggling. They're not executing on their work. Now we have a chance to intervene to make sure we're rebuilding those motions, and then we're working toward better results versus waiting until the assessment scores come in and we say, well, 10th grade didn't do so good this year.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think about, take a sign-off sheet in a restaurant's restroom. We've all seen them in there. You've seen ones where it was signed in the last hour. And I
Yeah.
would probably venture to say, I bet that restroom looks better than the one where there isn't one, or the one where you see a sheet on the wall from 3 months ago that has no sign-offs, but the date is 3 months ago. You know that they kind of thought this idea of accountability might work, but there was no follow through. And the thing I learned about the PLC dashboard is when principals have something like, it's like a scoreboard. I mean, Ross, if you and I were playing basketball, just if you and I were in a gym shooting some hoops and having some fun, we'd have a good time. But let's just say that, somebody turned on the scoreboard and all of a sudden it said Ross's score and Brig's score. We'd take that game a whole lot more seriously, and I bet we'd play a lot harder. And I think it's the same for educators. There are great teams out there doing work who probably are getting almost no recognition. And there are other teams on the same campus who are probably not getting much done.
Yeah.
And a busy principal sometimes can't even tell the difference between the two. And when I coach principals, I tell them, don't use the dashboard as a tool to humiliate or to punish. Use the dashboard as your indication of who needs more support, who needs more of you. And that's really what I think it indicates for me is who's under supported here. And at the same time, who's worthy of some celebrations? I mean, a dashboard can fill a staff meeting with things that are worthy of celebration or at least acknowledgement to just say, I want to shout out the third grade team who they're on their fourth essential skill plan and they're really crushing it. And the thing I also coach the principals I work with on is that remember, it's not about getting this template done. What it's really about are which kids who didn't at first learn did end up learning that essential skill because of our focus on learning, not just a focus on teaching.
Mm.
And what are the new instructional strategies that teachers are now implementing as a result of this process? Because if it's just all about paperwork, count me out. I don't really care. But we got into this profession because we love to see the light bulb come on in kids. We love to see kids who didn't at first learn things. And then when that's celebrated and that's easy to pick up off the template, right off the dashboard, and when new instructional strategies are celebrated, where some experienced teachers have picked up some new skills from some of the newer teachers, and newer teachers have picked up some skills and strategies from the experienced teachers, it just makes the work seem doable. It seems reasonable, and people on teams like that thrive.
Yeah. So along those lines of what this is doing for the administrator or enabling the administrator to do, how does the dashboard lighten the load for administrators?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was coaching an elementary principal, and this principal was a second or third year principal. I don't remember exactly which. And I said to the principal, well, how are your teams doing? How's the learning going? And he said, oh, they're doing well. And I said to this principal, well, how do you know? And he said, well, I just look at their PLC products in their Google Drive. And I said, oh, well, fantastic. Can you give me access? And he did. And so I got access to this Google Drive. And first one I clicked on was the kindergarten team. And I opened up this Google folder that said PLC, and in there it said kindergarten. And I opened that folder and there were like 42 different files in there. Some of them were labeled like common assessments. Some of them were labeled list of essential skills, and a variety of things. And then I clicked into the first grade and there were like 26 things in there. Some were folders, some were files. Started clicking into some of them, and I really, it was a mess. It was a colossal mess. And so I went back to the principal afterwards and I said, how do you really know how the teams are doing? And this principal got a smile on his face and he goes, I've got my hunches. And the truth of the matter was, he really didn't know how the teams on campus were doing. He really didn't know if the kids were learning the skills that were essential for them to learn. He really didn't know. And so that's a prime example of somebody who he'd like to be able to help out who needs help. He'd like to know, are the kids learning these essential learnings or not? But he just frankly didn't have the time to sift through, they call it Google Drive. It's more like a Google traffic jam for many
Yeah.
places. And how do you sift through that? I don't know many principals who can. Then they maybe mistakenly say, well, I guess I'll just go be with every team every week. When the teams meet, I'll be with every team. Well, that's unsustainable too. And frankly, it's quite a bit of wasted effort because some of those teams don't need your presence. You might need to check in with them and, be on their, a fly on the wall maybe once every month or two. But there are other teams on campus who, if you are not there, they probably aren't even going to do anything for the benefit of the kids they serve. And so I think principals who are well-meaning don't have a system to know how and who they should focus on.
Yeah. So if some of these principals have tried the PLC process and been unsuccessful, but they don't know why, right? Or they're not sure what they should do differently the next time. What would you say to them? How would you have them begin? Would they begin by trying to, you know, debrief and evaluate and identify what went wrong last time? Would they just kind of start from the beginning again? How would you encourage them to give it another try if they are convinced that it's going to be unsuccessful again?
Yeah. And if they don't try something different, it probably will be unsuccessful again. I mean, that's really a struggle. So the main, there are three main reasons that schools, teachers, principals struggle with the PLC process. The first reason they struggle is they don't know why. The second reason is they don't know how. And the third reason is they don't have the time or the support to do it. And that's how my book is laid out. It starts by saying, why are we doing this? What's our reason for why? Because if our why isn't strong enough, this is just going to seem like one more thing to do.
Yeah.
And so there are many reasons why we should do this. Everything from new teacher support to the research supports that this makes the biggest academic impact on kids, to job embedded professional development. I mean, if you and I were given the same assessment and I got 29% of my kids proficient, and Ross, you got 73% of your kids proficient, I ought to be asking, what'd you do? And that's fantastic professional development, because we're not only going to do it in this unit, we're going to do it in the next unit with a skill. And that job embedded PD is huge. So I'd really say to that principal who's had a couple of false starts or restarted many times, they need to make sure they know why. Why are we doing this PLC process? And that's really the very beginning of the book. Once we've established the why, then the how makes a lot more sense. And so what's the how? Well, the how is to say, all right, well, what are the steps that a team would go through first? What are the steps that a singleton should go through first? And to really help people understand, these are the actions that highly effective teams should take. And at that point, once people kind of got the idea how to do it, I say just go. Try it out. Try the template in the next month of school. And it's, learning to play football. I wouldn't learn, if I were starting to play football or wanted to teach somebody love for football, I certainly wouldn't get out helmets and yard markers and hire referees the first time we did it. All I'd do is start throwing a football back and forth. Just play a little bit of catch. And that's what my book encourages these teams and singletons to do, which is just start playing a little bit of catch. And catch would be something like this. Okay, in the next month of school, what's one skill you'd be embarrassed if a kid couldn't do in your class? And with that one skill, how would we assess whether a kid can do it? Doesn't have to be a paper and pencil assessment. Could be an observation, could be a presentation, could be a performance. And then what we do is we'd have a plan that would say, what are we going to do with the kids who don't learn it? Not if there are some who don't learn it, but when. What are we going to do when some of these kids don't learn it? And while we're intervening for those fantastic kids, is there a way we could extend the learning for those who've already learned it? And that's done in class. And so we try this once. And I would just say, if I'm that principal who's tried the PLC process, I wouldn't jump into how to do it first. I'd start with why. I'd refresh on that, make sure we have a good solid reason for why we want to do this. And it could be because many kids are drowning within reach. It could be because we're just not getting the results that our community expects. It could be that our new teachers don't have support. It could be that we want kids who don't have hope to have more hope. But any of these reasons are important to kind of nail down at first. And then give a doable how. And then the dashboard is just a little bit of the support to say, leaders need to know who needs that support. So that's what I'd offer, that encouragement, because, even I was one of those educators who had so many false starts in the PLC process, things that were just not of value. And I would say that doesn't mean there's something wrong with the PLC process. It could be there's something wrong with how I'm implementing it.
So as we're coming to a conclusion, once I've done that, so let's say I am that school leader who said, I'm trying this again and I'm going to do it differently. And okay, we're going to use dashboard. We're going to sharpen our implementation. Well, like, what are some early indicators that it's working better? And which may also be, of course, as you discussed, that you're getting those earlier flags about where the struggles are happening, right? But that also would be an indicator. But what are some of the first things that would be able to reinforce to that leader your implementation is working better, it's starting to work, you have things to continue to work on maybe, but you can tell the difference between what's happening now and what happened last time?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked because there's a couple of things that I point out in the book that I'm just going to point out now. One is that anytime you go down a new initiative, author Bruce Tuckman, he's a group dynamics expert who presented this in the 60s. He said, when you develop as a team, you typically go through 4 stages. Stage 1 is the forming stage. Stage 2 is the storming stage. That's followed by norming and then performing. And when I work with teachers and principals, I caution them to say, Tuckman's stages are coming. There's going to be trouble ahead. And that's not an indication that you've chosen the wrong initiative. As Tuckman would say, that's an indication that you are developing. And so I wouldn't sugarcoat it with an educator to say that the teachers are going to be singing kumbaya, that they're going to be all pumped to do this process. But I would say that you're going to need to get some quick wins as you make it through the storm and let everybody know. I wouldn't hide the fact that the storm's coming. I would make that overt. I would make it known to people that I'm expecting that as we go down this PLC pathway in a real way, that there will be storms ahead for us. And I certainly experienced them in my own life as a principal. And I certainly see that being experienced in the principals that I coach. But once they're on the other side of that storm, which, sometimes lasts a few months, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little less. But once you're on the other side of that, teacher teams and schools, they'd never go back. Once they've experienced meaningful collaboration, they'd never go back, because what's happening are that more kids are learning more and that we're growing as professionals in a doable, meaningful way. And so what would I look as some indicators that this is working right away? Goodness, I'd be taking screenshots of people's one-page template of their intervention plan. I'd be taking screenshots of where they started out at 38% of kids proficient in this skill, and now it's at 54%. And I'd be listing the names of kids who didn't at first learn, but now have, because the teacher's mindset is on learning. And those quick celebrations and wins that the dashboard easily illuminates for leaders are just the fuel people need to sustain and even support the change process. So those are some things that happen right away. And, tell the people I work with that you don't have to worry about getting the last ones on board this process. The hardest ones are to get the first ones going. The last ones, once the freight train is moving, you don't have to worry about getting the last ones on board. There's nothing else they can do except join the momentum of what's happening. Too often I think we focus on the naysayers, but give the energy in the beginning to those that are kind of convinced about the why and are willing to try the how. And before long, the change has occurred.
Yeah. So, listeners, we will put the links below. You can find the book, The PLC Dashboard, from Solution Tree or wherever else you get your books. Also, Brig's website, briglane.com. Brig, is there anything in particular you'd like to direct listeners to check out?
Well, thanks for bringing up my website. My website's got lots of just templates and tools for teachers and for principals. And that's what I do. I serve educators. So that's where I'm at. I'm on some social media things, but I put some things out there, but the best way is to get a hold of me is via my website. That's my favorite way. And that's what I do.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, the listeners, check that out. We'll make it easy for you. You can find the book there. You can go to Brig's website and you can find this book and his other books and resources and other ways to work with him. So that's a good place to start. Or you can go directly to Solution Tree, or if there's another place you like to get your books, do that.
Amazon. Oh, Amazon.
You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever you go, you can find it. So do that if you would like to, and links are below. Also, if you have not already, we really do appreciate those 5-star ratings and reviews. They really help other listeners find the show. So if you listen on Apple or Spotify or wherever you like to listen, please do. If you're enjoying the show, give us a review there. And other than that, we'll talk to you again next week. Brig, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Ross. I so appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the educators that are out there working hard.
You can invest in curriculum, technology, and intervention, but none of it works if students are not in school. I'm happy to share that there is hope. Playworks has an evidence-based approach to help you break through attendance and engagement barriers with the power of play. Safe, engaging recess leads to kids who are connected, who know they belong, and they're ready to learn. Learn more about this difference-making solution. Visit playworks.org/podcast to see exactly how Playworks can improve your attendance. That's PLAYWORKS.org/podcast.